I'm in Adelaide, trustee of the UK Society for Co-operative Studies, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Blase Lambert. Blase is the chief exec of the Confederation of Co-operative Housing and is a board member of Cooperative Housing International and also on the board of the International Co-operative Alliance. He's got practical experience providing advice and support to over 125 housing co-ops and social housing providers, and has numerous publications to his name, including the Code of Governance for Community-Led Housing and one on financing cooperatives and mutual housing. We're really looking forward to hearing from Blase tonight. The lecture is titled Cooperation in Housing, and will explore models of cooperation in the UK and international housing markets across different tenure types and at different price levels. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Blase.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good evening, everybody. So nice to see so many familiar faces, but also a few new to me as well. So that's very nice, and I hope you enjoy my presentation and speech this evening, and look forward to taking any questions that you have once we got through the formalities of the presentation and speech. So as Ian says, and I'm going to start screen sharing now, as Ian says, I'm the Chief Executive of the Confederation of Co-operative Housing, which is the UK's trade body for housing co-ops. CCH, as we call ourselves in a shortened form, is in its 30th year, having started off life 30 years ago with a small group of concerned co-operators, as they called themselves at the time, establishing a representative voice for housing co-ops. Today, CCH has more than 200 member co-ops in the UK, which is most of the registered provider rental cooperatives that there are, but also cooperatives of some different natures as well. I'm the treasurer of Cooperative Housing International, which is the global trade body for housing co-ops, and a board member of the International Co-operative Alliance. I sit on the ICA's board, formerly as the housing representative. So I'm going to speak briefly at the start just about CCH. So CCH promotes the excellent work done by cooperative housing organisations, fostering communication and serving the sector, and campaigning for quality housing cooperative solutions across the United Kingdom. It has three core aims that it has developed over time. Firstly, as a trade body, as a representative body, as you'd expect, to serve the housing cooperatives sector, to encourage growth within the sector, to encourage housing cooperatives to establish effective partnerships between cooperatives and with other stakeholder organisations, and to enable cooperatives to sustain into the long term, both in terms of their governance and membership, but also in terms of their property offers. Secondly, to enable greater numbers of our member organisations to network with each other and to communicate with us and with each other nationally and regionally. And thirdly, to campaign for quality housing solutions and actions that will lead to the growth of the cooperative housing sector in the UK. We have established over the last 20 years and grown our Centre of Excellence that seeks to provide advice and guidance, training and resources to housing cooperatives, both new and old. We published the first Code of Governance for Housing Cooperatives in 2001 in partnership with the National Housing Federation. I had the pleasure of attending a board meeting of Cooperative Housing International in 2012, the first UN year of cooperatives, to publish the second version of the Cooperative Housing Cooperative Code of Governance. And we have recently updated that so that it more broadly reflects new forms and emerging forms of what is now becoming termed more broadly as community-led housing. And that's the document that you can see on the right-hand side here, our 2021 version of the code. The Code of Governance is recognised by the Regulator of Social Housing as being the relevant and appropriate Code of Governance for housing cooperatives. In addition to the code, we also produce detailed guidance. Our governance and management guidance document explains in more detail how each of the headline requirements of the Code of Governance can be translated in practice, enabling cooperatives of varying shapes and sizes to interpret the code. Our smallest member has one house with 4 people living in it. Our largest member has several thousand homes, and the way, therefore, in which they do governance differs significantly. We've also developed over the course of the last 20 years a substantial policy and procedure database, which gives us the opportunity to provide bespoke documents for member organisations. And our policy and procedure database stands at more than 150 model documents. In addition to that, we've produced 5 sets of model rules for different types of housing cooperative, tenant management organisations, fully mutual housing co-ops that rent and are controlled by management committees, fully mutual housing cooperatives that rent and are controlled by general meetings, leasehold land cooperatives, and most recently, mutual home ownership societies. And we partner with Co-operatives UK to provide a gateway for new housing cooperatives using those model rules to incorporate. We provide financial modelling for new organisations and existing organisations to create financial business plans, assist them in assessing risk and creating appropriate risk management processes. We provide a broad range of training and accreditation programmes, both to housing co-op boards, to community-led housing advisors who are working out in the field, assisting new organisations in getting set up, and more recently, the delivery of the government's 4 million homes funded programme for all social housing tenants across England. We provide detailed bespoke advisory services for organisations, and also we have created a series of resources which we call Wayshaper, starting off with an options planning toolkit for new startup cooperative and community-led housing organisations. Earlier this year, we produced and launched the second Wayshaper product, which is the Sustainable Development Goals Toolkit, producing the only Sustainable Development Goals Toolkit and indicator assessment process that is available anywhere in the world. A product that we have been promoting internationally as well as within the UK. And we are in the process of moving towards creating some new Wayshaper products, both for the housing cooperative sector, but also for the broader cooperative economy that I would encourage you to keep a lookout for later this year and moving through next year. So that's a brief introduction to the Confederation of Cooperative Housing and the work that we do. I'm going to talk now a bit about the history of cooperative housing in the UK. And for me, the history has its earliest roots going right back to the work of Robert Owen, who took over management of David Dale's cotton mills in Lanark in 1800, and after breaking with his partners, created his new Lanark model community. He established the new Lanark village store, which was run by and for the benefit of the community in 1813, and indeed it could be argued that that was the first cooperative shop in the UK. And he is held as being a founding father of socialism and the cooperative movement. New Lanark is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and this picture here is a picture that I took of the first housing development produced as part of the new Lanark model community, something that very much could be considered as the first cooperative or community-led housing development in the UK. And moving on from Robert Owen, other early thinkers like William Thomson, who published his pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth in 1824, and Dr. William King, who set up a cooperative store in Brighton and created the Co-operative periodical in 1828, were early forerunners in creating thinking that would lead eventually to the 1844 declaration made by the Rochdale Pioneers. And taking a look back at the rule book of the Rochdale Pioneers, which I did a number of years ago, there's a very interesting clause within the aims that were originally within the setting up of the Rochdale Pioneers original society, such that they stated that the society had the aim to create the building of a number of homes in which those members desiring to assist each other in improving their domestic and social conditions may reside. So right at the very start of what became the broader cooperative movement, both in the UK but globally, The idea of providing affordable, safe, secure housing to people within cooperative structures was very much something that was written in, so to say. And this history moves forward over time. Between 1860 and 1918, what I consider to be the first wave of cooperative housing in the UK was developed. The pioneers themselves, the Rochdale pioneers, established the Rochdale Co-operative Land and Building Society in 1861 and built initially 25 homes. A later venture by them would see another 80 homes developed. Other societies started to build homes, and by the 1900 Cooperative Congress, it was recorded that 224 societies had between them invested over £5 million in 24,000 homes across the UK. Many cities still exhibit this history in street names like Cooperative Street and Cooperative Terrace. The early cooperative developments would lead on to co-partnership housing, garden cities, and the development of organisations like the Bourneville Village Trust. And indeed, an early pioneer or an original pioneer of the garden city movement, Ebenezer Howard, in his publication Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, published in 1898, set the wheels in motion for the garden city movement that would spin out of the early thinking of the co-partnership housing schemes. And work began on the first garden city that he was involved in, Letchworth Garden City, in 1903. Those interested in learning more about this early history would do well to read Andrew Bibby's excellent book, These Houses Are Ours, which also tells of the end of this first wave following the Addison Act of 1919. At the end of the First World War, the government was keen to create what it branded as Homes for Heroes. And in passing the 1990 Act, which became known as the Addison Act, it created the funding environments for local authorities and co-partnership organisations to develop those Homes for Heroes. However, because the government of the time was keen to encourage local authorities to take up this opportunity, they provided preferential financial terms to those local authorities over the co-partnership movement. The result of this was that local authorities would build many of the homes that came after the First World War, and the co-partnership movement would abruptly come to a halt. Academics and supporters of the cooperative housing sector often point to countries like Sweden, where 1 in 4 homes are developed and owned by cooperatives. But the Swedish picture was made possible because of the post-war public policies introduced there. In Sweden, there is no such thing as publicly provided social housing. There is co-ops. In the UK, differently, after the Second World War, our policy was primarily driven and focused on public sector house building, with successive governments during the 1950s and the 1960s boasting of having built more council homes than their rivals. And it is not until 1974, when Reg Friesen, who was the housing minister under the Wilson government, introduced what would become the second wave of cooperative housing in the UK, introducing specific funding and support through the Housing Corporation to enable the development of 450 housing cooperatives in England, aimed at people mainly on low incomes, mainly in areas like London and Liverpool, with a national network of secondary housing cooperatives developing these organisations and providing management services to them, and a national organisation, the National Federation of Housing Cooperatives, providing that tertiary level support to the secondaries and the primary organisations. During this period also, 47 housing cooperatives were set up in Scotland. And also this second wave of housing cooperatives that enjoyed public policy support and funding would also enable other groups of people to start establishing cooperative solutions to their housing situations. Organisations like Radical Roots started funding standalone, non-publicly funded cooperative housing schemes funded with private finance and loan stock. In places like London, short life housing cooperatives started taking advantage of many empty and abandoned properties, particularly street properties owned by local authorities. And indeed, a number of groups of people started buying up large stately homes and converting them into leasehold managed and owned housing cooperatives, many of which are still in continuance today. However, government policy in the 1980s moved firmly towards individual home ownership and focused social housing development towards the back end of the 80s on housing associations, with reducing grant rates and increasing reliance on private finance and a shift from capital to revenue funding. These policies advanced further up to the credit crunch in 2008. Growth in tenant management cooperatives throughout the 1980s led to a legal right to manage for local authority tenants being created in 1994, which would create the third wave of cooperative housing development, management co-ops. And indeed, 250 such tenant management organisations were set up in the years following that legal right being introduced. Today, more than 100,000 local authority homes are managed by cooperatives, most of which are in London, but there are some in other parts of the country in addition to that. However, an overdependence on dwindling governmental financial support and poor governance during the 1980s led to the National Federation of Housing Cooperatives bankruptcy in 1990, the decline of housing cooperatives and secondaries, and indeed the number of co-ops in Scotland had fallen to 19 from 47 and to 220 in England. And the number of secondaries by that time had fallen to 4. The Major and Blair governments accelerated the sale of local authority housing beyond the individual home ownership model of the Thatcher government's right to buy, with stock transfer programmes, and these alongside the introduction of the ALMO model and tenant participation compacts further limited the further growth of the TMO model beyond its initial spurt from 1994 to 1997-98. CCH began discussions internally about whether a cooperative alternative to the whole-scale transfer of local authority housing to housing associations could be created. And this led to the creation, firstly, of the community gateway model, and then subsequently in Wales to the creation of the community mutual model. The first resident-owned stock transfer was created in Preston, although it could be argued that the 1992 transfer of 921 homes by Westminster City Council to Waterton and Elgin Community Homes is an early forerunner of the gateway and mutual models. Leading up to the 2010 general election, CCH was involved along with other sector stakeholders and stakeholders more broadly across the social housing sector in the Commission on Cooperative and Mutual Housing. And the success of that commission led on to a period of new funding coming into what became branded as the community-led housing sector during the period of 2012 to 2024. Firstly, the UK government created a £100 million empty homes programme, which ran between 2011 and 2015. Then the Welsh government's cooperative housing programme was introduced in 2012, and the UK government further created a £300 million community housing fund programme from 2016 to 2022. Let me show you a few examples of cooperatives created in that second wave, that wave from 1974 until the sector, or that wave of the sector came to an end in around about 1990. Up on the top left here, this is a scheme from Liverpool. This is Lodge Lane in Liverpool. It's an ownership rental cooperative. There's 35 refurbished and new build homes, of which this is one, mainly in the Toxteth area, that was set up by a secondary housing cooperative, which has over time morphed into a service provider called Northwest Housing Services, which provides management services to them. On the top right, this is a development from the housing co-op that I used to live in, Brent Community Housing, which originally started off as a short life co-op on the Kilburn High Road in the late 1970s. This development was a partnership refurbishment scheme undertaken with Circle 33 in the Kilburn area of London, a refurbished rental management cooperative with a management agreement with a housing association. So a different type of co-op to the Liverpool example, where the properties are owned by the co-op. In that example, the properties were owned by a housing association that acted as a redevelopment partner and managed by the co-op on a long-term management agreement. In the bottom left-hand corner, some of you might recognise the OXO Tower, which is part of the Coin Street Community Builders redevelopment and regeneration programme on the south bank of the Thames. The particular housing co-op that you can see there, floors 3 to 6 of the OXO Tower, is called Redwood Housing Co-op. It's part of 4 short leasehold social housing cooperatives that form part of that development. And then the final example on the bottom right is Homes for Change in Manchester, a new build scheme undertaken by the Guinness Trust as part of the Human Regeneration Programme. A community and developer partnership delivering a housing cooperative that operated initially on a 25-year management agreement. But it's not just a housing scheme. There's workspace, there's a theatre, there's a community cafe, and it's an example of a housing cooperative, a bit like the OXO Tower example, that isn't just housing, it's a mixed development of which housing is part of the mix. I mentioned earlier on the Commission for Cooperative and Mutual Housing. In 2008, this commission was drawn up and produced a number of research papers, and eventually produced a major publication, Bringing Democracy Home, that laid out policy proposals in advance of the 2010 election. This report was widely acknowledged, and its proposals were committed to by all of the main political parties moving into the 2010 election. Shortly after that election, a subgroup of the Commission was asked to look in detail at financing options, and this report, Financing Cooperative and Mutual Housing, the front cover of which you see on the right hand side, was the product of that work. And this very much led on to the policy that would then come out initially from the coalition government after the 2010 election, that enabled the development of the start of the 4th wave of cooperative and community-led housing in the UK. And here are some examples of some of those more recent developments. Up on the top left is the Lilac scheme in Leeds, the first mutual home ownership society to be developed in the UK. Mutual home ownership society essentially issues equity stakes within the value of the cooperative's properties to its resident members, a sort of cooperative form of shared ownership, but without the equity cap and without the value drifting into the private market after the first person that's bought into the scheme sells their equity on. This scheme is low impact living in design and materials, 20 homes, common house and communal facilities. On the top right is the largest student housing cooperative in the UK. This is the Edinburgh Student Housing Cooperative, unsurprisingly in Edinburgh. They've taken over 2 halls of residence. You can see one of them here with a removal van in front of it. 106 members collectively manage their hall of residence. They're providing an alternative, an affordable alternative to the market-driven student housing accommodation that is so typically offered to younger people these days. On the bottom left is the Forge Bank scheme, which was undertaken by Lancaster Co-housing. 41 leasehold homes developed with high ecological standards, a common house and shared facilities. And on the bottom right is a development undertaken by Phoenix Community Housing. Phoenix was the 4th community gateway transfer that was undertaken in England. Stock that was owned originally by Lewisham Council was transferred over. Indeed, 6,000 homes were transferred over to this mutual housing association, Community Gateway Association. And what you're seeing here on the bottom right is an extra care scheme of 60 properties that Phoenix has built as move-on accommodation for existing residents who are members of the Community Gateway Association, a scheme that was designed in its idea and shaped in its design by the resident members that would ultimately take up residence there. Two of the biggest challenges that any developer faces, but particularly challenging for developers of small-scale community projects, are access to affordable finance and access to appropriate developable land. And I'm just briefly going to mention a couple of examples here of how cooperative and community solutions have been applied to those land and finance issues. And I'll start first of all with a scheme or a group of schemes undertaken by CDS cooperatives in the early 1990s as part of the Kent Housing Partnership, providing affordable cooperative rental housing by accessing a blend of affordable housing grant, bank debt, and an innovative interest guarantee cover provided by a financial intermediary set up in the first place by CDS called the Cooperative Housing Finance Society, which was able to de-risk the prime lender of the bank debt and therefore drive down the cost of finance. And the cost of finance to new startup community organisations is always such a challenge. Indeed, at the moment, what I'm hearing is that if a housing association is looking to access bank debt, it's doing so at about 5%. If a new startup community or cooperative developer is looking to do that, it's accessing it at about 12%. So this type of model of de-risking the lender and driving down that interest rate really helps to make cooperative and community-led solutions financially competitive when looking at what other organisations are able to access finance at. Green Square Accord, originally called Accord Housing Association, created an organisation called Redditch Cooperative Homes, again back in the late 1990s. Accord acted as the development agent, accessing the affordable housing grant and leveraging affordable finance for the bond market through its general bond market provisions. They have created 8 leasehold housing cooperatives in the Redditch area since that point in time. Coin Street Community Builders, which I showed the example of the picture of earlier on, an example of where discounted land, which is an ask that many in the community land trust world are keen on focusing at the moment, an example of where discounted land, affordable housing grant and cross-subsidy from non-residential activities, so they have retail, commercial, restaurant and other facilities on site, creating an income stream that comes into the mix and helps to cross-subsidise the affordable housing. Oscar in Derby was a scheme that we were involved in a couple of years ago, where the local authority put land into the mix at no cost, and again a mix of affordable housing grant, and the first project to be able to access local authority borrowing through headroom on its housing revenue account. We pioneered that work in Derby a couple of years ago, brought in ultra low cost finance through the access that the local authority has to the Public Works Loan Board, a notion that was then taken on by an organisation set up by the current chair of CCH in creating Bunker Housing Cooperative in Brighton, again accessing affordable housing grant, but getting on lending from the local authority. In Brighton, they didn't have housing revenue account headroom to borrow from the Public Works Loan Board on, so they borrowed on their general fund and provided not only access to that Public Works Loan Board affordable financing, but additional soft loans to fill the remaining gap. So if that's the overview of the history of the UK and some historic but more recent models, what sort of models of cooperative housing are there that exist internationally? Well, 5 main models of housing cooperative would be the ones that I would identify. Firstly, what is called non-profit rental cooperatives. These are similar to the UK rental cooperatives created after 1974. These cooperative own properties, which resident members rent at below market rents. These co-ops are common in Germany, Switzerland, and Canada, and provide a cooperative alternative to a federal or government-driven social housing model. Equity co-ops. Equity co-ops are similar to home ownership. These cooperatives sell shares to resident members, which grants them equity in their home. Whilst they don't own the home, the shares appreciate in value over time. These cooperatives are common in Sweden, Norway, and the United States. And then a bespoke form of the equity cooperative is the limited equity housing cooperative. This is similar to the UK's mutual home ownership societies and to the equity cooperatives, as I said, but where the growth in equity value is limited and therefore protects future affordability. So whereas in the equity cooperative, all of the uplift in value is taken by the resident member when they leave, in the limited equity model, some of that uplift in value is locked inside the cooperative to ensure ongoing affordability. These cooperatives are common in American cities like New York, Washington, DC, and San Francisco. Fourthly, mutual aid housing cooperatives. Similar to the UK's self-help or self-build cooperatives, where members join together to build their homes through solidarity and self-help by pooling their resources in terms of money, but time and work and activity. These cooperatives started off, first of all, in Uruguay and have spread to many parts of South and Central America in recent years. And finally, right-to-use cooperatives, where the cooperative owns the property and grants members a right to occupy a property whilst they remain a member of the cooperative. These cooperatives are common in Denmark and Catalonia. And I thought I'd show you a few examples of some schemes from Europe. Firstly, Berlin. Here are a variety of photos that I took on a recent study tour to Berlin as part of my work in Cooperative Housing International. On the top left is the Adlershof Charlottenburger, 121 properties built as part of a larger 1,400 property development within a new science park. So they've created the new science park, they've developed 1,400 properties, and they've specifically ring-fenced a slice of those properties as being specifically for cooperative housing, 121 of them. On the top right is an older building, although not such an older cooperative. Indeed, the building is old, the cooperative is not so old. This is the Bremer Hoa. When sale of this property was proposed to an investor in 1999, the residents quickly established a cooperative to buy the 850 properties and commercial units that this particular shot shows one corner and frontage of. It's a much larger development that you can see there from that picture. In the bottom left is the Studentendorf, which is one building that forms part of a new build student housing village that has been created in Berlin. And on the bottom right is one of the buildings that forms part of the Treptow Sud housing cooperative, a multi-generational cooperative that's been in existence for over 60 years and provides people with appropriate accommodation through the different stages of their life. And I'd show you a few schemes from Zurich as well. Similarly, I snapped these pictures on a working visit. So there in the top left is one of the component parts of the Meerhaus Wohnen development. Indeed, the building that you can just see on the right-hand side, it curves round more substantially to the right, was a winner of the 2024 Design Award in Switzerland. It's an excellent development. It's a mixed-use development of cooperative residential, commercial, but also there's a health centre on site, elderly apartments, a school and a neighbourhood park. The whole development is a cooperative development, a mixed-use development, a mixed price point development, and a real exemplar. On the top right is the Jugendwohnnetz FOGO development. This is a new development of housing for refugees and young adults which not only provides housing and accommodation, but provides training in food, in small business, provides cultural and educational offers for the residents. The housing features shared modular timber framed apartments built to the highest energy efficiency and ecological standards. And down at the bottom is a significantly older development than the two up the top in Zurich. This is the ABZ Ottostrasse Luftbild development. And you can see the entire four sides of this development here taken from a high view shot. This was the first open courtyard perimeter cooperative settlement in Zurich, where the corners, you can just make out the corners of the development. The corners remain open. And this very specific design that was part of the plan, allowing air in through the sides of the development to enable better air circulation around the centre of the scheme, better light entry, and also the removal of unfavourable corner house floor plans. So what of the future? Well, I wanted to speak briefly about the CCH's manifesto, which we published in February of this year, which we circulated to all of the political parties in advance of this year's general election. Some of these policy asks we're already making some progress on. Others we're pushing forward with over time. So, firstly, we want to see a cooperative housing tenure. One of the things that is notable when you look at the Swiss schemes, for example, is that they have the legal, regulatory and financial frameworks in place to enable the development of cooperative housing. We don't have that in the UK. Despite various waves and iterations of cooperative housing over time and support from governments that has gone up and down, at no point have we secured from a UK government bespoke legislation to create a tenure form for cooperative housing. Secondly, we would want to see the creation of a financial intermediary that would enable new and existing organisations to access affordable capital, but also allow existing member cooperatives, of which there are many, sitting on substantive property assets, to leverage those assets to build and refurbish new and existing cooperative properties. In 2021, we managed to secure an exemption in the budget for stamp duty land tax at the enhanced rate and annual tax on enveloped dwellings for fully mutual non-registered provider housing cooperatives. We call in the manifesto for that exemption to be extended to all forms of cooperative and community-led housing. We've called for support for multi-staker investment models to be created. I know that's a particular problem for organisations looking to create student housing co-ops, for example, where they're leveraging funding from a number of different stakeholders. We would like to see promotion for new forms of cooperative housing, such as co-housing and mutual home ownership societies. And moving on, or building on what I said about the work that we did in Derby and the example of bunker housing cooperative, we will want to see more enabling of cooperatives to work in partnership with councils to access the Public Works Loan Board and to create a presumption in favour of cooperatives in public land disposal and planning, which would be a real game changer. If we could get the sort of presumptions in favour that exist in countries like Switzerland, where if public assets are being disposed of, they are first offered to community and cooperative options rather than being sold into the private market, that would be a real game changer. That's a difficult task, but it would be a real game changer. Well, I hope you found that presentation interesting. Here's my contact details for those of you that would be interested in taking them down. Do feel free to drop me a line if you want to discuss in more detail outside of the session any of the things that I've touched on. But in the meantime, I'm going to stop screen sharing now and look forward to taking any questions or comments that you may have.